Zach, how would you score your leadership so far out of 10?
Oh, well, that's a tough question. I'm not going to score my leadership. I'm going to dodge that question. But the party, I'm going to say, is on a 10 out of 10 right now. There is still 9 out of 10. We've got room for improvement. But ultimately, we've had over 22,000 new members recently. That's a 33% increase in the entire membership since I launched my leadership. We've had lots of defections this year from the Labour Party at the council level. And I think there's just a sense at this conference that actually this is the Green Party's moment. Every year, I think it's fair to say in the last few years, we've scaled up and scaled up, but it does feel like a huge leap this time. But actually, I think we're catching the balls. I think it's all working really, really well. And there is always room to grow. And of course, the severity of the crises facing us means there isn't a moment of complacency here. But I also think, the political answer would be this and this and this. But actually, I think the real genuine human answer is it's exceeded expectations. It's going really bloody well. And the real question is what happens next month and the month after that and in the lead up to the election.
So you've got a lot of momentum. You're going to have those May elections in, with regards to local elections in Scotland, Wales, England, all over the shop. You're going to do really well. How many councillors do you want to win?
We don't have the numbers yet. Because
you don't have a target?
Well, because at the moment we're still selecting those candidates. But what I would say is we've had targets and we've already exceeded, as in we keep going. Actually, could we do more right now? So an example of this is there was a local election in Brighton just last month. The Labour Party absolutely collapsed. The Green Party went on to win it. In Barking, just last month, we had 3 defections from the Labour Party. So whether you're talking about defections or actually winning elections, which is what matters in the end, we're seeing time and time again that the Green Party are cutting through in ways that we haven't before. Now, so I'm not being disingenuous. Some of this is to do with reform, cutting into the Labour vote, which means that we're coming up in other places. And while that's good in kind of the short term, there is a concern about how well reform are doing. But I also go, who is going to stop reform? What is the alternative to reform? We know the Labour Party aren't going to do it. They're pretty much just replicating what reform are doing. And so I think the role for the Green Party has never been more obvious, which is actually to be bold, to present a progressive alternative to this failing Labour government, to challenge reform, not in mealy-mouthed ways, but actually to take them on, to take that fight on. And without being too earnest about it, but it's the thing I hear more than anything at the moment when I'm going through the streets, no matter where I'm in England and Wales, people stopping me and saying they're feeling hope again. They've not felt hope for a long time, but they finally feel like there's a vehicle now, there's a space for them to go, which isn't perfect. No one's saying it's perfect. I don't think it's perfect. But actually right now, right behind us, there's a conference going on. It's democratic. It's one member, one vote. So if people see it and think it's not perfect, but these are the things I'd change, then I'd say get involved, get voting, and let's change it to, I don't think it'll ever be perfect because a political party shouldn't be perfect. It's got to be different things to different people. But ultimately, I think we have a shared sense of mission, which is lowering people's bills, protecting our NHS, challenging the genocide in Gaza, and ultimately saying to people that if you're sick of the old establishment politics and the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, I totally agree with you. We all agree with you. But don't go to reform, the politics of division, the politics of despair and hate. But if they can rocket through the polls and get to number 1, there is literally no reason why the Green Party can't do that. I think it's belief in ourselves. And I think it's about making sure we're getting out as much as we can through media, through social media. I've got my podcast now, Bold Politics. That went to number 3 in the country the first week we launched it. So I don't think it's about one thing. I think it's about all of these things working together. And finally, I'd just say, this isn't about me. I'm obviously part of it. I'm sat by a big face of myself, which is awkward. Actually, it's about growing a team. And what I'm really excited about is the idea that some of our next MPs haven't even joined the Green Party yet. They're people who are inspired by what's going on right now. He might not have even looked at the Green Party before. They might have dismissed it and gone, what do they know about the cost of living? Or are they a class party? Are they a socialist party? We're all those things. And actually, I think what we haven't done in the past is effectively communicate that. I think as soon as people start to hear from us more, I think our polling ratings are going up. I think our elections are going up, and particularly in London and in the Senedd in Wales. I think it's going to be a really good May.
So somebody might be watching this. And by the way, I saw your speech earlier on. Fantastic. I think it hit all the right notes. You sounded like a competent, confident politician of the first order. The pitch sounded like that of a mass party. So when I say mass party, I mean Labour, the Tories, the Lib Dems, trying to speak to the whole country, not just 10% of it. Which is always the temptation. And I can imagine a reform voter hearing your lines on cost of living, bills, NHS, and saying that resonates with all of me, but you're not talking about immigration.
Right.
And they might not be even anti-immigration. They might say, we want 100,000 people a year, the NHS needs it, we need it, maybe even have some refugees, But you're not being honest about the fact that when you have net immigration of 900,000 people, like we did in 2023, that's clearly going to contribute to the housing crisis. Clearly. And I can't get over the fact that the Greens aren't honest about this one issue. On the rest of it, cost of living, public ownership, I'm there. What would you say to that person?
Well, first of all, I'd say I am being honest. So even in the speech, I talked about Paul, the guy I met from Clacton. There's a very deliberate reason I put that story in, because he was someone in Clacton who'd voted Reform, who we didn't agree with on immigration. So it would have been easy for me to find a story where someone had agreed with me, we got on well, and they voted Green. But I very specifically told a story of someone where we agreed on everything, and then I think the lines I used in the speech where we agreed on lots of things, and on other things there are still lots of conversations to be had. We have a housing crisis, whether immigration is higher, whether immigration is lower, that's just a basic fact. We need more, particularly council houses. The problem with housing is that it's unaffordable. We know many property developers are land banking, they're sitting on the assets.
They would say it's more unaffordable when you have net migration, and that's just 1 year, and it probably is a one-off, but they would say it's more unaffordable when you have net migration of 900,000 people. What would you say to that?
But I don't think that matches the facts, because we're not building the houses. I think if we were building all the houses and it was still unaffordable, then I'd go, wow, this isn't clearly an issue if we're not built on brownfield sites and developers aren't land banking. But while developers are still land banking, we know that they are the issue. They are literally holding that. Now, I don't think that's conspiratorial. If you're a property developer, if you're looking in the most cynical capitalist system, how do you make money? It kind of makes sense to sit on the land, let the value of it go up. This comes back to the most basic principle in politics. Are you for people or are you for profit? Now, it's not as binary as that. I think you can be for people and you can be for profit in some circumstances. We're clearly not in those circumstances. Those landlords are solely looking at profit. And that's a much more wider philosophical question about what kind of society we become, what kind of society we become when a Labour government is stuffed, literally stuffed, with lobbyists, former professional lobbyists, whose jobs it literally was to think about how can we protect property developers, oil and gas companies, armed trade companies, and gambling companies. So we shouldn't be surprised when those guys get into government or they become MPs for the government. And then they're still trying to protect those wealthy and vested interests. I think the person who put this best to me recently was Chloe Swarbrick. So she is the co-leader of New Zealand Greens. She said to me, when she first got into politics, she kind of, almost in a naive way, thought, if I just give people the right information, if I'm just an amazing orator, if I can connect with people's fears, I can really present the statistics and data, then I'll win people over. And then she said it didn't take her long in politics to go, no, there's this big other missing piece. It's for vested interests. It's for multimillionaires and billionaires who largely control mainstream media, who are pushing these narratives, these constant narratives around NIMBYism when you're trying to protect nature, or trying to explain why the Green Party are, bad on this, that, or that. Now, do we need to be held accountable? Do we need to be scrutinized? Absolutely, that's part of politics. But it's a pretty unbalanced game. And I think the housing crisis and immigration is one of the starkest examples of where very rarely we are actually talking about facts. We're talking about narratives. I'm not suggesting you're doing this, by the way, but narratives that have been pushed by those vested interests. And I don't think it's a surprise that those property developers donate to the Labour government. They donated to the Tories. And so it's not a surprise that pretty much our entire planning laws, our entire housing laws, they're not thinking about how do we deal with the actual problem in this country. Never mind migration. That's like so low down on the list on trying to find a more positive way of doing community cohesion. They're just going, how do we serve the people who gave us the money to make them more money as property developers? And we're just in that vicious circle. So what I'm talking about here is a few things. It's about immigration, it's about housing, but actually underlying it is political lobbying, which I think is one of the biggest scandals this country has yet uncovered. I think it will be like the blood scandal or the post office scandal. I think at some point when someone really digs into how the political system works, how Westminster works, and the vested interests that politicians have, I think people are going to be outraged. And the final thing I'd say is, I was on a BBC regional round yesterday, so this is affectionately known as the Liz Truss round, where you just sit there and you have like 20 interviews, one after another. And one of the regions, I was pretty much saying what I just said, but much smaller form. And he put on an outraged voice and he said, are you telling me that you think there's politicians served by our, elected by our communities who are now serving big business rather than the communities? And I was just like, I think it's more outrageous you're even asking that question. Like it is so patently obvious to the public. And I think there's never been a wider gap between where the public are and the distrust of Westminster and where Westminster is. Now that's really dangerous because if we keep eroding trust, that's like fuel to Nigel Farage's story. So we need to in some way have this complex, nuanced conversation about lobbying and make sure everyone knows that Reform and Farage are right in it too. 95% of their donations were from oil and gas companies, £2.1 million. And actually, it's interesting when you do polling, nothing annoys people about Farage and Reform more than when you talk about where they're taking corporate donations. So this is a long answer to your question, but I think on immigration, it's recognizing we don't have to agree on everything. But what we do have to do is point out the hypocrisy of those people who have been shit-stirring, who have only been doing it for their own excess power and wealth. And actually, the problem here is not migrants who are just trying to seek a better life. The problem is a broken political system that protects the powerful and the wealthy.
On Farage, let's say there's a hung parliament. You support PR, right?
Yeah.
Nigel Farage claims to support PR, although, of course, that's going to be tested if they win the majority of seats after the next general election. Let's say there's a hung parliament. There's a campaign. There's momentum for electoral reform. The Lib Dems are on board. The Greens are on board. And Reform are on board. Would you campaign alongside Nigel Farage for PR after the next general election?
I'm going to have more nuance to the question. So am I campaigning that there's, say, a Labour Prime Minister and campaigning on PR gets PR? Or am I campaigning to get PR through a Nigel Farage Prime Minister?
There's a hung parliament. Presumably, it would have to be a Lib-Lab coalition of some kind, or confidence and supply. Reform would maybe be the largest party, certainly one of the two largest parties. And there'd be momentum for electoral reform because the electorate could see that the system isn't working, it's not producing majorities, it's not producing effective governance. Nigel Farage gives you the call. Zack, you've done so well, you've picked up 20 MPs, I think you're a really good campaigner. Let's get together and change the electoral system. What would you say to him?
I'm mainly bothered that Nigel Farage has my phone number, but I'll answer the question. I'll give you an unsatisfying answer and then hopefully a more satisfying answer. The unsatisfying answer is none of this would be my decision alone. We're a democratic conference. And so ultimately, when we're looking to make deals with that, it would obviously be with the MPs and making sure that the Green Party membership were behind whatever deal we were making. The more satisfying answer is my opinion, I suppose, in those conversations. I wouldn't do anything that would make Nigel Farage Prime Minister. That would be an absolute red line, and that includes proportional representation. I think in Nigel Farage, we're dealing with a fascist, and as much as I will do anything, almost anything, to make sure we have an actual democracy in this country, I would say making a fascist a Prime Minister would seem counterproductive. In terms of a Labour coalition, it's something...
So you wouldn't support PR if it meant that made Nigel Farage Prime Minister?
No. I just think ultimately you have to have a red line. And although if you said to me, what's the number one thing that I think would change the British political system, I would say it's PR. Now, before I get atted, I realise that that can seem privileged because people are really struggling with their wages, they're struggling with the cost of living crisis, they're struggling with fascism and racism. All of those things absolutely matter. But until we get proportional representation, I think it's very difficult to deal with those things meaningfully because we know we could get Farage being Prime Minister on 25 to 30% of the vote. Despite a majority not electing him, he could get a huge majority. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's a reasonable scenario. So PR has to absolutely be the number one thing that I think will unlock all the other things that so many of us want. I do also think, though, that there has to be basic standards. And seeing Nigel Farage go into number 10, I think no longer becomes about a democratic or constitutional conversation. I think it becomes about a crisis, particularly for minority communities, particularly for people who are already terrified and scared. And I could absolutely rule out that under no circumstances would I accept any part in making Nigel Farage Prime Minister. A Labour-Lib coalition is a different conversation. I would still find it very difficult, by the way, to make Keir Starmer Prime Minister for different reasons. But suppose we had a different Labour leader, depending on what was on the table and what we were getting, then I'd certainly be more open to that conversation.
So Nigel Farage might be watching this, or one of his comms people, or Richard Tice.
He loves Novara media.
Or Zia Yusuf. They would say, hold on, Zack, you've got us completely wrong. We are actually the thing stopping fascism. They might say, or even just racism, like Tommy Robinson. We are the firewall, because if we can't get political power, or at least influence, to change how this country does immigration, law and order, a ton of issues, if those votes won't come to us through the electoral democratic system, then they'll go to people like Tommy Robinson, not through votes, but through things like street violence. We're trying to do this through procedure, through legislation, through an orderly way of changing things. That would be their argument. So we are not the means of fascism and racism and violence. We're stopping it. What would you say to that?
I'd say that's bollocks. We know for a long time that the established kind of acceptable face of fascism has been politicians in suits, and that's largely what we're getting with reform. I really want to distinguish between people who are thinking about voting for reform voters or people who are even considering them, and the people who are running the party. The people who are running the party know exactly what they're doing. Everyone else, they know what they're doing, But I think a lot of the time they're just actually really disillusioned. They want to see investment in their communities and they're not seeing an appropriate vehicle for that. I'd go a step even further though. I'd say it's not just Zia Youssef or Nigel Farage that are essentially ushering in fascism. The Prime Minister has to take a responsibility for this too. He stood at the podium and quoted Enoch Powell. He said somehow that he didn't know that that's what he was doing. I think that's completely incoherent. And I think if that's true, that's also very problematic that he doesn't know his political history, that he didn't know that he was quoting one of the worst fascists this country has ever had.
Do you think he knew what he was saying?
I think he knew exactly what he was saying. It wasn't a one-off. We've had dog whistle after dog whistle. Let's go for indefinite leave to remain. Taking it from 5 years to 10 years, what is that going to achieve? If people want Nigel Farage and they want reform, they'll vote for Nigel Farage and reform. And so it's a tale as old as time. Donald Trump says it today, Nigel Farage shouts it tomorrow, and then the Labour government move into that position a week or two later. It is a doom spiral. And even in, let's take the ethics of it aside, I think it's strongly unethical what Keir Starmer's done to be elected on a platform of change and then to completely spit in the faces essentially of the people who have voted for you, or lots of them. It's also bizarre and ridiculous. You're not going to win an election doing that. I cannot believe they're not looking at the poll ratings and going, I wonder why we're plummeting. I wonder why so many people in this country right now don't feel like the Labour Party have got their backs. And so what I would finish on and saying to those people, whether you voted Labour in the past, Conservative in the past, Lib Dem, or indeed Reform, which has been the centre of this conversation, then actually have a look at the Green Party, because we do politics differently. You might not agree with us on everything, but as I love the quote that Zoran Mamdani has been using. If you agree with me on 9 out of 12 things, then let's get on and do it. If you agree with me out of 12 things, go see a psychiatrist, because that's not normal. We don't have to agree on everything. And I think on immigration, we don't have to agree entirely on immigration. A red line for me is you have to want dignity and care for migrants. But I think most of the country want that. I think even you vox popped, when you speak to people on the street, very quickly they can go from stop the boats, I hate migrants, a minute of reasonable conversation, and they've usually backed off. And they go, I'm worried about the country, and they might even go, I still don't want migrants, but now we're talking. I think when you're talking and when you're listening, that's when things can happen. Will it be easy? No, but changing the country was never going to be.